a lot of my stuff is psychoeducation. It's like, let me teach you what authenticity really means. Let me teach you what choices and freedom and responsibility, what do those terms actually mean? Honestly, I think self-betrayal is probably one of the most prevalent reasons and ways we lose ourselves because it's so subtle. And we don't even understand that we're doing it. The reason why we don't understand how dangerous it is because we haven't been taught how the self is created. So we think that we can do whatever we want, make any decision we want, and it won't seriously impact us.
Yeah.
The reality is every single decision you make either makes you more authentic or inauthentic. I think the consequences of moral injury are quite dire, suicide being one of them, addiction being a really common one, withdrawal from society and isolation, so much shame. And I think it's because it doesn't target the things that you do, it targets who you are and it tears you apart.
Zdravo svima, dobrodošli u još jedan Agelast podcast, još jedna nedelja, još jedna epizoda i hvala vam što ste tu sa nama sve ove godine. Pre svega da se zahvalim što nas pratite, za vas koji nas ne pratite, kliknite to belo dugmence subscribe i zapratite našu YouTube stranicu i pomozite nam da rastemo. Hvala vam puno na tome. Ukoliko želite da ovaj sadržaj ostane nezavisan, kakav je do sada bio i da učestvujete kao svojevrsni producenti, ne u kreiranju samo ovog podcasta, nego i pratećih sadržaja koji imamo poput Agelast sessiona, tamo daleko i tako dalje, kliknite na linkove koji su u opisu, a to su naš Patreon, donacije, koje može, mesečne donacije na Patreonu i naravno jednokratne donacije ukoliko vam je tako slađe i lepše i lakše preko PayPala. Ako nas podržite, hvala vam puno na tome i svima vama koji nas već podržavate, hvala vam beskrajno na tome naravno. Također želimo se zahvalimo našim partnerima bez kojih ovaj podcast i sve što radimo ne bi bilo apsolutno moguće. Pre svega tu su naši dragi partneri iz Volta. Kao što znate, Volt je sajt za kućnu dostavu. Pored kućne dostave hrane imaju do kućnu dostavu svega i svačega. Idite, proverite, napravite profil tamo, izaberite promo kod sa imenom našeg podcasta Agelast i ostvarite 3 puta po 200 dinara popusta na prve 3 porudžbine. Također želimo se zahvalimo našim partnerima iz United Clouda, koje s moje leve strane. U današnje vreme dizajn digitalnih proizvoda predstavlja privlačnu oblast koju mnogi dizajneri žele da se posvete. Upravo zbog toga u razvojnom centru naših partnera iz United Clouda product design je jedna od ključnih funkcija. Kao IT kompanija s portfolijom od 13 svojih proizvoda, United Cloud je napravio dizajn studio posvećen kreiranju modernih UI, user experience, UX, user interface modela dizajna za svoje proizvode. Također, u studiju se bave i customer researchom i art visualom. Zbog toga imaju takozvani otvoreni koncept prostora sa kreativnim zonama, što im omogućava da stave različite prototipove u ruke korisnika u prostoru koji simulira njihove domove. Rad u dizajn studiju doveo ih je i do prvog projekta korporativne društvene odgovornosti, odnosno CSR na engleskom, kako kažu Corporate Social Responsibility, a to je saradnja sa Fakultetom primijenjenih umetnosti u Beogradu, koja je rezultirala kreiranjem skulpture lebdećeg oblaka koji možete ovdje vidjeti ako je lebdi zahvaljujući magnetima, zaista impresivno izgleda. Također želimo se zahvalimo našim partnerima iz Mazde. Kao što znate, Mazda ima 5 ključnih vrednosti koje se činjavaju core njihovog brenda, koji Mazdu zaista u kategoriji vozila u kojima se nalaze izdvaja na tržištu kao jedno od najkvalitetnijih, ako ne i najkvalitetnije vozilo u tim kategorijama. A našu sledeću gošću bih uporedio sa jednim od tih vrednosti koja nosi naziv Jinbaitai, koja nosi naziv zapravo jedinstvo, u tom slučaju jedinstvo jahača sa konjem u starom drevnom Japanu, koja pretpostavlja zapravo jedinstvo čoveka u vozilu sa automobilom. Sve što je tu je predviđeno i prilagođeno njemu. Zašto to kažem? Zato što naša gošća je zapravo terapeutkinja, psihoterapeutkinja, odnosno bavi se egzistencijalnom psihoterapijom u čijem središtu se upravo nalazi čovek kojem treba da se posvetimo i čije probleme treba da rešimo. Šta je egzistencijalna psihoterapija zapravo? Kako ona vuče svoje korene iz egzistencijalizma, to jest egzistencijalne teorije, egzistencijalne filozofije? Kako su Kjerkegor, Sartr, Hajdeger i drugi filozofi zapravo tvorci na neki način i kako su potonji psihoterapeuti razvili granu nauke koja trenutno se zaista razvija i značajan progres pokazuje u svetu, a Sara, naša gošća, Sara Kuburić, kako je na engleskom zovu Kuburik, je zapravo devojka poreklom sa ovih prostora, ali koja je odrasla u Kanadi, ali naravno boravi svuda u svetu, tako da će ovaj podcast zapravo samo početi na našem jeziku, vrlo kratko, ali ćemo vrlo brzo preći na engleski jezik i celokupan razgovor će biti na engleskom jeziku, ali ne brinite, bit će sa titlovima. Naša sledeća gošća, doktor nauka, terapeutkinja, egzistencijalna psihoterapija, Sara Kuburić. Zdravo, Saro.
Zdravo.
Smejemo se jer oboje znamo da će ovaj razgovor da se nastavi na engleskom u nekom trenutku.
Također.
Ali...
No, that's not. See, I can't do it.
Nema veze. Ali nekako je, znaš, koliko si intervjua dala posljednjih, kad je knjiga izašla?
Septembar 19.
Znači, 19. septembra izašla knjiga. Koliko si intervjua dala umeđu vremena?
Preko 50.
Koliko ih je bilo na srpskom?
0.
Možemo barem 5 minuta.
Baš si poseban.
Možemo barem 5 minuta.
Možemo, ajde.
Prvo dobrodošla.
Hvala.
Zadovoljstvo mi je veliko da si tu i zaista se radujem ovom razgovoru. Iako imamo veoma ograničeno vreme, potrudit ćemo se da nabijemo što više stvari u ovo vreme koje nam je dostupno, s obzirom na to da ti je raspored veoma gust. Da samo kažemo našim slušalcima, veliki deo razgovora će biti na engleskom jeziku, ali ćemo imati titlove, tako da ne brinete ništa. A za naše drage prijatelje koji slušaju na engleskom, ne brinite, ovaj deo će ubrzo biti gotov. Da li će biti engleski titlovi dok sad pričamo, vidjet ćemo to.
Okay.
Hajde malo o tebi. Prvo, ovaj deo koji možemo da pričamo na srpskom, odnosno na našim jezicima, kako god. Ti si Kanađanka. U suštini. Odakle iz Kanade?
Ja sam odrasla u Vancouveru.
Ok. Ali si poreklom iz ovih prostora?
Da. Ja sam bila rođena u Vlasenici, znači u Bosni, onda smo se preselili u Sremsku Mitrovicu. Tamo sam živjela, 7 godina i onda smo se preselili u Vancouver.
U Vancouver. Koliko si imala godina kad si otišla u Vancouver?
9.
9 godina. Wow. I ostatak života, obrazovanja i svega si provela tamo?
U Kanadi i Americi, da.
Ok, ali koliko sam razumeo tebe, umeđu vremenu si postala nomad.
Da, ja od 24. godine sam krenula da putujem, od tada I don't have a base.
Okay.
Mislim, Australija mi je base, tamo mi je kuće, tamo su mi knjige, tako da znam da mi je to base. Da. Ali inače, na primjer, sada već nisam bila kući 8 mjeseci. Svake godine putujem 6 do 9 mjeseci, tako da kuća je tamo gdje sam ja. Ok. Mislim da je ovo dosta razgovora.
Neću više da te mučim.
Stressful, it was difficult,
Nećemo da te mučimo više. Let's start with the topic that we have today. The topic basically is existential psychotherapy, and your book, which is, should I say the Serbian headline or the English one?
Both. It's on me, na meni je. There you go, I did it.
There you go, both of them. But before we dive into the existential psychotherapy, we need to give the context of it. So we need to dive into existentialism, first of all. But before we start with existentialism, I would like to focus on you a little bit. So, because you have PhD in existential psychotherapy, so how does the academic road leads to that point, that particular point?
So I have a Bachelor of Science in psychology undergrad. Then I have a master's in counseling psychology. Then I was part of a training in particularly existential analysis on the side. And then I got a doctorate in psychotherapy science. And I think, you know, when you start with your master's program or graduate school, you start to narrow down topics that you research, the modalities that you practice. And so for me, I started off being like, I'm going to be a CBT therapist. And I really believe in like the Freudian concept of determinism. And it was really fascinating because I was so adamant about it. And then I went through a personal crisis and did a 180 where I'm like, actually, I think those theories for me personally aligned because it was a way that allowed me to escape myself. And it felt really good for what I was going through at the time. And then when I hit an existential crisis, I learned more about existentialism and I changed my whole way of practice. And so that was a really interesting thing. I think I would have arrived at that conclusion anyways at some point, just because it really aligned with the way I conceptualized the world. But it was kind of at a point where I was going through a lot. And so that was the switch in my direction. You know, I was like in neuroscience, like that's the direction. And now I'm like phenomenology, poetry, like human self essence. And so I feel like I've kind of dabbled in all of it. And this is where I've landed.
Escaping yourself is a very important point of everything that you've said right now, because it's going to be very important in the further conversation. But one thing that struck me when starting to read your book, two things basically. First of all, you start with testimonial type of narrative. You're talking about yourself. You're talking about the crisis that you went through that led you to the path, as you said it already. But on the same note, you had just small comments that I think that for most of people would go unnoticed. But I wrote it down. I don't want to butcher it. Yeah, I don't want to butcher
that.
But it's how to notice self-loss, for example, and then you said because when you recognized it in yourself, it was easy for you to recognize it in other people, but not before that.
Yeah. Correct. I think part of it is I didn't know what self-loss was, and I didn't know that there was another way to exist. So I thought everyone hated their life.
Okay.
I thought everyone was unhappy in their relationships. I thought everyone just did things because that's what they were supposed to do. I thought everyone was a little angry and a bit sad and thought about death, and reflecting back, I'm like, wow, those are some red flags. But I think as a society, or depending what culture you grew up in, sometimes we normalize really hard things to the extent where your existence is reduced to it and you go, but this is how I have to exist. And so I think self-loss was a really powerful moment of, like, I talk in my book of looking in a mirror and going, I don't know who this girl is. And not just that, I hate her. And that's a really difficult thing to write down and even admit to myself. But that was how I felt. And so I think it was interesting to have that entire experience, then stumble upon this concept of self-loss and realize, hey, I'm not alone in this. I'm hearing my clients sound awfully like I did 10 years ago. And so that was interesting because you become more sensitive to it. So let's say that you want to buy a car that's a Toyota. All of a sudden, you'll notice Toyotas everywhere because you're like, your mind is primed to look for it, to investigate it. And I think the same thing kind of happens here.
Yeah, of course. But also, as you said it, there was a bunch of red flags. But the moment you looked yourself in the mirror was the peak of this.
I don't even know if it's a peak. The only reason why I'm saying that is because then I went home, watched an episode of Friends.
And felt a lot better.
And was like, yeah, you know what? This is fine. This is totally okay. And that level of self-delusion or denial, deception is shocking to me. And then I went off and I was like, I'm going to go back to my life. It is only the next morning when I had a panic attack because my body was like, she's not getting it.
Yeah.
It was only then I think that I was at the height of like, I think I'm dying. And while I thought I was dying, I realized I never lived. that was the peak of it. But I think it's shocking that I went through something pretty like severe, like that mirror moment, and then still was like, no, we're fine. I'm good. Yeah. I'm just going to keep on going.
Because prior to that, you have lived a life that on paper seemed perfect.
Correct, yeah.
But on the other hand, it was you have completely lost yourself. And you describe it in a book. So there's a gradual process to reaching the point of looking yourself in the mirror, hating yourself, and then later on having a panic attack.
Yes.
But in order for us to understand what does it mean to have life in order on paper, which means nothing. Which means nothing. We need to understand certain other things such as effectuality, such as fullness, and existentiality. But in order to understand those terms, we need to understand the basics and give the frame of references for our conversation, which is actually existentialism in philosophy. And this is the part that I'm looking forward to. So
can see.
I'm trying to summarize this, to cram it, in such a small frame.
I mean, I'm so jet lagged. Lead the conversation.
So
I will.
I'm just gonna give you the points, and I'm gonna let you. Let you fly.
Okay.
So I think that I think 4 maybe philosophers are very important in order to understand the frame of references. First one would be Kierkegor, right?
Yeah.
The individualism. The second one would be Sartre. How he put it. I'm trying to remember in English. Content of freedom. Is it right? Yeah. The third one would be definitely Martin Heidegger. The biggest one.
The biggest one,
of course.
The flex,
Authenticity and unauthenticity, and you're gonna lead us to that point, which is very important in understanding the existential psychotherapy. And the fourth one would be, I don't know, Nietzsche maybe?
Nietzsche, yeah. I didn't talk about Nietzsche, actually, in my book very much. So the 3 that I focused on, because obviously every philosophy has so much to say about so much.
Yeah.
So what I really focused on was trying to understand how these philosophers developed the conceptualization of the self. And so I used a lot of Kierkegaard, I used Sartre, and I used Heidegger. And those are probably my main 3 homies. My favorite line in the entire book, and I can't believe they didn't cut it, is because I've cited Sartre so many times. They said, my boy Sartre, like my homie Sartre, near the end of the book, and everyone kept it, and I was like,
well, it's a nice perk to have it in the book, because it makes it more relatable to to us common people. Because not everyone's in philosophy like that, but it's important.
Fair enough.
But it's important to understand existential psychotherapy before we go into it. So let's start with the individualism by the definition of Kierkegaard, and lead into the anxiety
of freedom. Yeah. So the thing about Kierkegaard, which is interesting to me, is that he's considered the father of existentialism by many, and yet he was very religious, right? And that's interesting, because I think if now you think about...
Sorry, the book came.
Oh, the book is there. I think now, yay! It kind of matches his shirt. I love that.
Yeah. And mine, not really.
Not yours. I mean, compliments it.
Okay.
And what I find fascinating is if you think existentialism, most people do not think religion. And so I think he's such a beautiful way of mixture of like very deep thought and handling the freedom and unease of life while still being grounded and rooted in something that he truly believed. Now, a lot of people also argue he's not a true existentialist. So what I liked about him, and the thing that I drew upon heavily, was his concept of the self being something that's rooted in necessity and possibility.
Yeah.
And Sartre has like a version of that later on. And necessity is things that must happen. You must be born, you must die, you need food, you're this tall, whatever. Yeah. And also anything that's a necessity is something that's happened in the past, so you cannot change it. And then you have the possibilities, which is everything that hasn't happened that could happen.
Yeah.
And what I love about him, I think he has a line that says, like, you can't look in a mirror and go, there I am. Because yourself happens in the past, in the present, and in the future. Therefore, you can say, this is me in this very moment. but this is not me, because he cannot be you, because there's so much more of becoming, the perpetual becoming. That's what I love about existentialism, and that's something that I drew upon from him. It was like this perpetual becoming of self rather than finding being the self, which is essentialism. Essentialism believes that there is an essence that's given to you, and all you have to do is either accept it or not. You either fail to embody it or you succeed. And existentialism, I think Sartre said, like, you know, you first exist and then you create the essence. And so I really like that. I think there's something really beautiful and even therapeutic about the way that Kierkegaard talks about like the necessity and the possibility of the self.
Yeah, and there is something that resonates very modern in Kierkegaard's definition of how he put it, that individuality is lost in the infinite, and that individuality is lost in the finite. So you kind of, you know, have to be in between those two.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, if we really want to reduce it, it's like take life seriously and don't take it too seriously. Don't believe that you're going to live forever. Be conscious of the time you've been given, but at the same time, don't be paralyzed by the time that you've been given. And I think that that's an interesting interpretation of something like that.
And one thing that I found common within your book and the Kierkegaard's opinion is that those two things, the finite and the infinite, do not exclude each other. You can fall under both of them at the same time. So, for example, the finite could be the models that were put on you by the society, the culture, the family, so on and so forth. So you do things by the book because that's the way the thing's supposed to be. But at the same time, being completely paralyzed in front of the infinite choices of the things in life you can have, and thus not choosing any of those.
And I think sometimes people, you know, I mean, I feel like Sartre really talks about this in Bad Faith, is like you choose your constraints. Most people choose to be constrained by society, by rules, by religion, by whatever it is, which, by the way, totally understandable because they do not want to face the freedom. The freedom is so scary that we would rather live an inauthentic life that someone gives us than create our own. And I think, you know, Kierkegaard's that's like such a famous quote of like the freedom of anxiety. And I think that's what we're seeing in today's generation in particular, because I think, you know, millennials and Gen Zers, they're having more freedom than ever before, and you are watching the paralysis occur.
Yeah, and well, the choosing part is going to be very important when it comes to Sartre, right? And then later on Heidegger. But let's just reflect on one other thing when it comes to Kierkegaard. It's about the I forgot the word, the anxiety. The anxiety of freedom, as he puts it, the dizziness of freedom.
Dizziness of freedom.
Yeah. Can you reflect on that?
I mean, I think it's. I mean, I think we covered it. It's like it's looking at it, and I keep talking about Sartre because I think he just makes sense, because it's going, what is the right thing? So many of us are trained to go, I want to know the right decision. And I think when we talk about authenticity, Sartre is like, there is no right decision. There's just a decision you take responsibility for. That is the right decision. That is the authentic decision. And so I think Kierkegaard is more presenting the problem than the solution, of like explaining how difficult it is. If you're not rooted in yourself, how difficult it is to figure out what these possibilities mean and how to take advantage of them, or how to create yourself through these decisions. Yeah,
okay. Well, then the key word for Sartre in regard to the previous part of the conversation would be responsibility.
Yeah.
Let's go on into the responsibility in the freedom and the choices that you have to make in life.
So he says we're condemned to be free, but we also understand that the degree of freedom you have is correlated to the degree of responsibility. So if you're if you're free to make a choice, you're responsible for that choice.
Yeah.
If you weren't free to make that choice, you're not responsible for that choice. And I think that that's fascinating. And he's saying you are condemned because you can never escape the responsibility of living your life. And people do not like that, because we like to go, I did that because this person did this to me. And what he's saying is, cut the crap. You are always responsible for how you show up. And, you know, he talks about bad faith. He talks about self-deception and how we deceive ourselves, or the bad faith we have is when we pretend we have to be one thing, when in reality we have the freedom and the responsibility to be something else.
Yeah.
And so I like it because he seems so relentless about that point. And I think in our modern society, responsibility is a really difficult pill to swallow. And that's why I named my title what I did, because I kind of wanted it to be like, it's on you. That's responsibility. I might as well have just put responsibility as my title.
Yeah, responsibility, but also not just responsibility. This is going to be handy when it comes to Heidegger. It doesn't, and also later on, after Heidegger, when we're going to talk about, I think there's two more people that are really needed to be mentioned throughout this conversation, and those are your professor Alfred Längle,
amazing.
yeah, Alfred Längle, and of course Viktor Frankl.
I knew. See, you didn't have to say it. I know who we're talking about.
Yeah, well, you wrote the book, so it makes sense. But and this is the point that Viktor Frankl, where Viktor Frankl stood out, which he took from Heidegger,
yes.
And it was that.
Do you know there's a picture of them together?
No.
They knew each other.
Well, I found out from your book that your professor knew both of them.
Yeah, my professor, I don't know if he met Heidegger, but he knew Viktor Frankl. He was his favorite pupil, which is really fun.
Yeah, which is so you have
a lineage. Yeah, it's great.
Very important lineage. So there's also this thing that him as I'm talking about Viktor, him as a Holocaust survivor, saying that it doesn't matter how the ring of necessity is tight around you. There's always the choice.
It's so good, though, and people hate that argument. And then when they hear who made the argument, they go, well, shit. You know, because they want to be like, well, I lived through this. And what I love about that is, like, you have to be cautious of when you quote it, obviously. You don't want to be insensitive. But at the same time, like, he realized that, you know, the last human freedom is choice of attitude and making meaning of the experience. And we can learn so much from that. I think when we stop feeling free, we stop feeling human.
Yeah.
And I think there's so many things in life that make us stop feeling free. And so I like that he's saying, no, you're always free. What a statement from a Holocaust survivor. Like, you know, and I think I have a line in my book that's like, what's our excuse? Like, if he can say that, who am I to be like, I don't have the you know? And I understand some people, I'm very blessed and privileged in the way I live my life. But I feel like all of us can reflect and be like, okay, if he can say it, how can I say it and mean it? And what does that mean in my life? Yeah,
but also this idea kind of circles back to the ancient Greeks also, because you have it all around Greek mythology. You know, the only way to express freedom when necessity is tight around you is through yourself.
Through yourself? Yeah, but it's the only thing we can control.
Yeah.
Truly, like, and when I say control, sometimes we can't even do that, but it's like the only thing you have ownership over, which, you know, is very Heidegger, so, you know, nice transition. The only thing you have ownership over is yourself.
Yeah.
And we forget that, and we also want to make sure that everyone else is helping us have the life that we want, and we're blaming everyone else. This is saying,
Okay. But also, it just recalls the previous part of our conversation when I said that, you know, before things happen to you and before you recognize self-loss in yourself, it was difficult for you to see the self-loss in others. So it is a journey.
For sure, it's a journey. Yeah. And I don't think self-loss...
It's not just a decision. I have made a decision now, and that's it.
I mean, no. You mean the loss itself?
Not the loss, the finding the meaning in necessity.
Oh, my God. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, another thing I want to say about freedom is, like Sartre said, like, you're free within, you know, what life has done to you. And I had to go, okay, what has life done to me? And what have I pretended I don't have freedom about? And then I realized that there's no such thing as an overarching meaning in our lives. that was mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And I love Viktor Frankl because in his book, he's like, people will come to me and be like, what is the meaning of life? And he'll go, that's like asking a chess master, what is the best chess move? He's like, that makes no sense. And I love how cheeky and honest he is. And I think that was an interesting thing for me to realize that our sense of self is not static. I don't build it and then go,
no, don't worry.
Check?
It's a robust thing.
Yeah, good. I'm not like, check, now I get to live my life as this person. Because if you do that, you're going to be inauthentic in about 3 seconds. Yeah. And so I like that there's this understanding for me now that your meaning and your sense of self are both ongoing and they're both parallel. What people don't understand is the connection between identity and meaning. Yeah. It's never talked about. And so that's really where I, do my work.
Let's dive into Heidegger then.
Yes.
Yeah, because we're gonna skip a few things and then we're gonna have to dive into Heidegger. Sorry.
Yeah.
So, where would be the good start when we talk about Heidegger?
Authenticity, being, perpetual being, design.
Yeah, before that, a little bit, just a little bit, maybe because
he's famous.
Yes, I know he's famous. Yeah, but he was the pupil of Edmund Husserl, right?
Yes.
Who is the founder of phenomenology.
Correct.
And he noticed one thing that it's not about. So I just want to say this. It's not about the things that we are looking at. We should look at the way we're looking at things. So we should make this shift to just pull back a little bit because the way we're looking at things have a bunch of biases.
So bracketing.
Yeah, bracketing. Yeah, of course. That's what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
And the more we try to apply this rule of the way we are looking at things, over time we're gonna see a pattern a pattern emerging. And once we realize this pattern and we pay attention to it, we're gonna be able to see the nature of things behind the essence, right? The essence, and this essence that he's the bracketing, yes, this essence that he's talking about, then. What he's comparing it to, like the natural state of things and the essential state of things, and this is where Heidegger jumps in when he's making he's going into argument with Husserl about the things that he claimed and dwelling into his own, which makes him Heidegger itself. So I would like for you to take over now.
I mean, and I feel like phenomenology is still debated.
Yeah.
I think this is a really hard topic to talk about. And something that I particularly studied, Husserl is considered more like when I think about his theory and research, it's more descriptive to the things themselves. How can you see that thing as for what it is? How can you purely see its essence through bracketing, through this purity of description? And then you have hermeneutic phenomenology, which is what I studied and conducted my research. But that incorporates interpretation. That is saying, okay, what did it invoke within you? What were you struck by? So there's a whole movement saying you cannot truly bracket. That's interesting. And how is the researcher also part of the research and the outcome? And so what I want to say about phenomenology is like everyone is striving to see the essence of things, and I think that's absolutely beautiful. But depending on like what branch of phenomenology you are dedicated to, you will have a slightly different understanding of how it works.
Yeah, so I wrote to myself to trying to be concise.
Yeah.
So when we mark those things, we find the essence of things, as Husserl said, which divides into two parts, the necessary things and the invariable components. But where the Heidegger makes a differentiation, he says, when we take these elements and if we move them from things to humans, then to human experience, then we cannot talk about then we cannot talk about what is being, because it cannot be answered. We cannot talk about. We can only talk about the way being are. We can only talk about how does this experience looks like? And once we start going into that, then we start realizing that there's a bunch of variations because every human is different. So
it's like phenomenology is the study of the lived human experience, right?
Yeah, and that's when he felt into, because the Descartes, the arch nemesis, I think, of Heidegger.
They all had one.
Yeah, they all had. So he said famously "cogito ergo sum," right? And Heidegger was like, "That's bullshit," because there's so many variables into the way we think, and why we think the way we think, and what defines us in the way we think. So everyone's thinking can be different, so therefore everyone's different. But if we try to define what is the common ground behind all of that, that's when we dwell into. That's when we go into the Heidegger's famous Heidegger's famous term called.
Design, being in the world.
Being in the world, yeah. So let's go into design.
Yeah. I think he talks about the fact that we cannot exist without the world. And that, and that's a really important one, because I think there's a lot of movements now that's like, you isolate and you figure it out. And I think he's saying, no, you and the world are one. You are what creates, you create the world and the world creates you. Yeah. And it's this beautiful existential dialogue between the two. And what I love about design, which is like kind of my entry point, I think, into a more philosophical type of thinking back in the day, was the perpetual molding of the self. And the way that the world does that, and the way that you do that through self-expression. And I kind of, this conversation we're having, we're going to walk away as slightly different people.
Yeah.
The fact I had matcha today instead of coffee altered something. And I really like that, because I think it places the responsibility, but also the liberation of what it means to be human. And I like that his conceptualization of the self is that fluid, although obviously if you go into being in time, it is quite complex.
Yeah, so, well, the thing about design is that, for example, if we take, I don't know, prehistoric human and modern human, prehistoric human would be, I don't know, concerned about, he would care about, I don't know, the primitive tools that he used at the time in order to survive. The modern human would be, I don't know, preoccupied with a filter using for Instagram photo or whatever.
Correct.
So what is the common thing in their design? It's about, the tools and the circumstances and the culture and the outside things that influence us, and those are the necessary things that influenced us, but the things and those things are the things we care about. So this is, I think, very important in understanding that where Heidegger differentiates and which falls into existential psychotherapy, the things that we care about, which defines us. So he has this in order to reach the point of his authenticity. We need to explain three things, which is factuality, the fullness, you say it. Fullness.
Now that you've said it.
And the third one is existentiality, which leads to authenticity.
Here is a suggestion for the sake of the podcast and the timing. Yeah. I think what would be more important is to define Längless for fundamental pillars, because he draws on all of these concepts and summarize them in saying there are 4 things you need in order to live a existentially fulfilling life. Okay. And here they are, if you're willing to do that pivot. Only because I think it's a lot more tangible than this.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so what I love about Alfred is he saw Viktor Frankl's meaning, man's search for meaning, and the emphasis on meaning. He said, that's great, but that can't be all. Can meaning really therapeutically save us from our own existence? Is finding meaning enough? So what he proposed like 4 existential questions that you work with. One is, I'm here, but can I be here? What do you think that means? I'm really curious. I'm here, but can I be here? What's your instinct?
Well, it's hard for me to rely on instinct when I have so much information now in my head. But I really like the quote which said, "There's a difference between thinking and calculating." Yeah. So we can do a bunch of things in life and be somewhere and doing something, but that doesn't mean we think about those things. It means we are calculating those things and adding up to a certain result that we want to achieve or run away from. It doesn't matter. But this is not finding the greater sense of the truth behind them, which can give purpose to whoever you are, and or being on the path discovering who you are.
I love that. That's so cool. So what this question is saying is like, you exist because you've been thrown into existence. Existentialists love this phrase, thrown into existence,
yes.
Right? But can you actually be here? Meaning, do you have safety, space, and protection to feel like you can exist, truly exist? So someone who's experienced a trauma, which we can talk about in the Balkans a lot, is like, you are physically on this planet. It was not your choice. You're thrown into existence. But do you have the sufficient safety, support, and space to truly develop or allow yourself to exist in that space?
Okay.
And I love that question because it's not just about being physically present. It's about existentially being present. And a lot of people can say no. So if you're struggling with trauma or anxiety, usually the answer to that question is no. Yeah. The second question is, okay, I'm here, but do I like it?
Okay.
Do I want to be here? Like, is there value? Is there connection? Is there a relationship? Is there something that gives meaning to this place? And they don't use the word meaning in this particular question, but it's like, okay, great. And some of us would go, well, suck it up. You're here. Be grateful that you're here. But really the question is like, you can be somewhere and not want to be there. And that's an important psychological thing to consider. And so there's a lot of exploration there. And then the third question is, can I be myself? And I like this one because this pulls on Heidegger. And it's like, do I have permission to be myself from myself and from those around me?
Yeah.
Because it's very difficult. If others do not give you permission, you're going to really struggle because we need others to mirror our experience. I can think whatever I want about myself, but I need someone in my life to go, yeah, I recognize that that's you. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to confirm that. And that's so disorienting. And then sometimes we don't give ourselves permission to truly be who we are. And so I love that when it comes to the identity piece, it's like, do you have permission? And then the fourth one is, what is my meaning in life? And I love the reframe because a lot of people will go, okay, what is happening in my life that can give me meaning? And the existential reframe is, what is life asking of you so that the way you answer life is meaningful?
Yeah, well, you address that in when you're talking about the inner consent.
Yes.
Yes, and when you're talking about inner consent, but also in order to start answering those questions, there's a few steps that you need to fill in before doing that. Because being thrown in life, as you said, means that you have to understand the circumstances that you were in and just, acknowledge them and be aware of them. Then there is the expectation of the society, the family, expectations from yourself, there's all sorts of different pressures that you have. So you have to acknowledge them too.
Yeah.
And then there's this existential third part that lives, which is within that remains is where I find the freedom, the truth. I find myself. So you have to, is it discern the word? Those things. So you have to put those things on one side, and this is a process. It's not an overnight thing.
No.
Sometimes you have an epiphany, but it's a different story. But it's a process to discern those things and then to separate what's left that's supposed to represent your particular journey.
I love that. I think discernment is a really important word there of like, you are told since you're born who and what to be and what is expected of your existence, and you need to figure out what actually fits and what doesn't, and what you want to fit and what you don't. And so, for example, let's say that you grew up super religious. So you grew up with a structure. And then people, sometimes argue, Sartre was one of them, that you can't be free and authentic if you belong to an institution. Essentially, that's kind of the vibe he's giving. And I don't think that that's true. But what has to happen for you to live an authentic life in that context is to go, here is what my religion, or here is what my culture, or here's what my whatever has taught me. The rules, the regulations, the restrictions. Yeah. Do they align? Have a moment of assessment and discernment. If you go yes, then you can be very religious and very authentic. Yeah. But if you've never tried to evaluate the alignment or take ownership of the decision of being religious, but just are, because that's how you were born, that's when inauthenticity can creep in. And I think authentic is maybe a good thing to define here, according to Heidegger. Yeah. So I love it because most people use and misuse authentic all the time. It comes from Heidegger. He coined it. He talks about him being in time. And essentially, the German translation is ownness, to own. It's like responsibility all over again. I mean, that's what it means. To be authentic is to own your decisions. And I think that's a very unsexy definition that people are not going to like, but that's the literal being an author of your life and owning everything that you do. And then he says, on the contrary, inauthenticity is disownment, and it's putting down the pen and not writing the pages of your life.
Yeah, and when you said the way he coined authenticity and the way it's colloquially understood, it's two completely different things. And that also goes for the caring part. Yeah. Because the way we colloquially use the word care and the way he frames the word care, because when you're mad, you care. When you're sad, you care. So whatever it is that you feel and whatever is that you shifts your emotion in a psychological state, it means you care. It doesn't
100%. A therapist, one of the worst things to see in if you're a couples therapist is apathy and resignation. Yeah. That you're like, shit. If they hate each other, if they're yelling, they still care. If they're not, and there's absolutely no evoked emotion and nothing that is moving them and striking them, that's when the work is really difficult. Yeah.
And another thing that I want to reflect on as a result of the previous things we have said is that what this means that in today's age and world, we can be successful by any account, by any standard. We can be successful, we can be on paper completely fulfilled people, but be at the same time completely miserable and unhappy. Yeah. Which rolls back to the beginning of the conversation with your own example, where you're leading with your own example, the way you're not just unhappy, you start hating yourself.
Absolutely, because I think I realized the responsibility, the role I took. I think, some of the hardest things for us to get over is not that we're in pain, but the realization that we caused the pain. It's like, you're the reason why you're experiencing that pain, and that is such a difficult thing to swallow. And most people don't. That's why they don't recognize their own pain. They want to ignore it. And being good on a checklist. So something that I write about, and it kind of got some traction. It was interesting. It was like, I have accomplished everything I've ever wanted and I'm still unhappy. I think that's like one of the newsletters I wrote. And I got so many DMs. And people who are like CEOs of companies, people who are living the quote-unquote dream, are getting to that height and going, what the hell? I am so unfulfilled. And so you have two options. One, pick another goal, start climbing again so you don't have to think about it. Or figure out why you're unhappy. And it's not that the goal isn't good. The goal was great. It's that it wasn't yours.
Yeah. Wow.
And that is the real issue. That's what people don't understand. It doesn't matter what your goal is, as long as it's yours. Otherwise, you can reach the highest heights and be incredibly miserable.
Which leads us, because if you thought that this was complicated enough, it gets even worse.
Oh no.
Yeah, because you just said something very important that leads into the next part of segment of your book, which includes two main things in understanding your goals. It's or the meaning. It's two big problems: identity and role play. So I would like you to start this one with the examples that I really liked, and you said also checklist. So you know which example is going to be about the checklist. There's three examples that I really want you to elaborate on, which would be easier for people to understand. So first one, you had a girl with the checklist.
Oh, the good girl?
The good girl,
yes.
with the family that mom already.
Oh yeah, the rules. Okay,
the rules, the rules, the list of rules, the updated list of rules. The updated list of rules.
Yes, correct.
So that example. The second one would be the husband who cannot get over the fact that his wife infidelity, and the third one would be the TikTok mama.
Oh, okay. Yes, let's talk about all of them. And really what we're stumbling upon in these examples is causes of self-loss, right? So the first one is a checklist. So this was, I guess, tell the audience the story. I have a client who has a very tight family. She moved away. She lives on her own. She's a lawyer. She's in her 30s. But her family means a lot to her and kind of still dictates the way that she lives her life. And she walked into a session one day and then just got really emotional and I had no idea what to expect. She's like, I really need to talk to you about something. I was like, I'm all ears. Lay it on me. And she pulls out her phone and starts to read this list of expectation after expectation after expectation. And essentially her duty was to write off, to sign off on it, to go, I understand, and to be an active part of this family and to still belong here, I am going to agree to do all these things. And some of them were about not having sex, about what she would eat, what she would wear, what she would whatever. And, her mom this was sent by her dad, and her mom is the first one that was like, I'm so on board. This is great. Thank you. And this is not the first time that these rules were sent around. It's just the updated version. And it was so difficult for her because she had so much love for her family and she wanted so strongly to belong and to honor her parents, which by the way is so beautiful. But she also understood that everything they asked her to do was not who she was. And so what was she supposed to choose? She had options to do what they say and not be herself, to ignore them and lose something of great value to her, or to live a double life.
Okay.
And I think that, that's an extreme version of it, but so many of us are in contexts where we are there are rules imposed on us and we don't know how to say no. And then we allow these external things to shape who we become. And then you become the perfect daughter. Congratulations. And you still hate yourself. Yeah.
The second one is different from the previous one, but equally important, is the husband who was facing the infidelity of his wife, and as if I remember correctly, he still hasn't resolved this in his late 60s.
Yeah. So this is an interesting one of like how we overcommit to certain roles in our life. So this individual committed himself to being a perfect father, and perfect husband. And that meant a lot to him. So his life revolved around these roles. And because he was so dedicated to that cause for so many years, he essentially forgot that other roles existed. And that's who he became fully.
The identity.
His full identity. Then his wife, after, a decade or two of being together, cheats on him and he finds out. And the rug is pulled under him. So his foundation of his identity is being a husband and a father. And he no longer is one of those things.
Yeah.
And he's no longer the same, he is a father but doesn't have the same access to his kids. And so what he's grappling with is like a death of his former self that he has no choice to gain back. He doesn't have the freedom to be like, and now I am a husband. It's like, no, you're not. That's not a freedom that you have, not a choice that you can make with that individual anymore, because she didn't want to go back together. And it was so difficult that even in his 60s, 70s, this individual still cannot get over the fact that this life was stolen from him, that this identity was stolen from him. And I think when when we meet those individuals that like one thing happens to them and they over-identify with the pain, with the event, with the loss, that's quite dangerous, because we are so many things. And part of working through that is realizing what else you are.
Yeah, realizing what else you are and what else you can be.
Exactly, I love that. Nice addition.
Well, when things doesn't go your way in the way you expected, and almost certainly it's not going to go the way you expected.
It's never going to go, right? But and I think like so many of us do that. It's like, I'm a student, I'm a podcaster, I am and it's like, be careful with the what I am words you're using, the descriptions, the adjectives. It's like, you are not just that. And I think we lack the capacity sometimes to hold all that we are. And we see this in parenting all the time. You become a parent, all of a sudden you're just, that's all you are. You're a mother, you're a father. It's like, no, but you had a whole sense of identity prior to it. This is supposed to add to that sense of identity, not fully replace your sense of identity.
Yes, and also those identities go hand in hand with role play. And before we go into another thing that's really important in connection to those previous ones, I want you to go through this example of
TikTok mom.
TikTok mama. Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's important to know that existentially, yourself has to be expressed. That's how it comes into being. You cannot just think you're a certain thing. You have to act like that thing before you become that thing. Mm-hmm. So what that means is whatever role you're participating in is the role that you're going to feel that you have become. And so I watched this TikTok where a mom was saying, she had a 9-month-old and all she was talking about was her infant. Makes sense. Yeah. And then she got comments that said, being a mom is not a personality. And she was really offended by that. She's like, well, of course it is, and blah, blah, blah. And I thought that exchange was so interesting because I understand what they're saying and I understand what she's saying. To her, she became purely a mom because that's all she did for 9 months. Yeah. So to some extent, is she wrong? Because the way she's been acting is not balanced. She's not trying to preserve other aspects of herself. The way she's expressing herself is purely as a mother. So it feels like her only sense of identity. And what the others are saying is it should not be your only sense of identity. And that, that's a completely different discussion to be had. But I absolutely love that because so many of us will take one thing, express ourselves in one particular way, and then lose all sight of the other roles that we're playing in life and over-identify with one particular role.
Yeah, and when we talk about this, this whole thing about the self-loss, I want to introduce certain, I don't know if we said ground rules. Maybe rules are not the best choice of words, but let me rephrase this, and you're gonna correct me. So. The causes of self-loss can be, as you said, 3 different things. It can be life-altering events, model behavior, and family rules that we touched upon.
We touched on 2 of those things, yeah.
Those examples. And there's a third one.
The bonus.
The bonus one, betrayal.
Yeah.
Self-betrayal. So we touched on those previous 2 ones, the life-altering events, for example, when you become a mother, or maybe life-altering events can be a trauma of some sort. We can infidelity
even. Someone cheated on you. That's very traumatic. Yeah.
And model behavior and family rules. We touched on those ones, but we're gonna come back to the life-altering events because I want to throw you in the mix with the life-altering events you had, which would refer to the normalization of trauma that we have here, common thing in the Balkans, but later on in the conversation, like a mental note. Yeah. But let's go into self-betrayal. Yeah.
Honestly, I think self-betrayal is probably one of the most prevalent reasons and ways we lose ourselves, because it's so subtle. And we don't even understand that we're doing it. The reason why we don't understand how dangerous it is because we haven't been taught how the self is created. So we think that we can do whatever we want, make any decision we want, and it won't seriously impact us.
Yeah.
The reality is every single decision you make either makes you more authentic or inauthentic. There's no neutral ground. There's no, well, this action did nothing. And so I think self-betrayal, especially in relationships, is something I see. It's like, it's okay to compromise whether or not you want to have Chinese or Italian food with your partner. It's probably less okay to compromise on values, morals, and boundaries. And people are so, I remember myself dating in my teens. It's like I pretended to like hockey, like I dressed a certain way. I did my nails a certain way because I thought, that's what my boyfriend liked. And again, it's not his fault for having preferences. It's my fault for taking them as like my doctrine,
Yeah.
And I think these compromises happen so much, and it's okay to compromise. But if we self-abandon, what happens in self-betrayal is that our loyalty shifts from self to others. And your loyalty has to remain on yourself. And so it becomes this gradual thing where you're like, oh, that's okay. Oh, it doesn't really matter. Okay, it's not that big of a deal. But it's almost like you're standing next to a speaker, and every time you betray, you take a step back, a step back, a step back, and eventually you can't hear the music. And that, I think, is a really good metaphor of what happens with self-betrayal, like the erosion of self, that eventually you're like, I hear nothing, and I actually don't even know what I want and like and prefer and need and what my values are, because I have just pretended for so long and compromised for so long that now I have zero idea.
Yeah, and you have just lost yourself.
You have just lost your... Congratulations.
You have reached the end point.
Self-loss.
Self-loss. Yeah, the good analogy would be the frog that cooks itself.
Perfect analogy for that, yeah.
And there's another bonus one, which was the most interesting one to me, because somehow looking at my own experiences, this is the one that I found myself the most.
Tell me more. Tell us more.
It's the desire to be lost.
That was the most fun to write. I was like, I'm just going to add this and people are going to hate it. I'm just gonna
I don't know why would they hate it.
Well, because I think it's very confrontational.
That's not a reason to hate things.
Well,
but it can be the cause of desire to lost.
Yeah, exactly. So tell me, how did you find yourself in that one?
Well, the things have a way to reach a certain point of no return, in which something happens inside of you, similar to your panic attack, when you realize that your self-preservation mode is more important than anything else. But you need to reach that point.
Gotta reach that bottom.
Reach that bottom. And once you hit the bottom, there's only one way from there.
Yes.
Yeah, so let's say it's something like that for me.
Yeah.
It's something like that for me. But I've spent years in perpetuating and having the same pattern of behavior, which to me at the time looked like, I don't even know how to put it. It was comforting in a way, in a weird way, weird way. Like depression can be very comforting things that you can lay in it and just enjoy yourself.
I'm glad you said that.
It's a very counterintuitive way to put it, but it's true. It's also the great excuse for whatever, and it's kind of accepting that things that have happened to you have completely it's something that you cannot do anything about it.
It defines you.
It defines you and becomes, in a way, the perfect excuse to not do anything. And then you somehow irrationally, I don't know how we'll put it, but somehow irrationally you just, instead of fighting against it, you just go with it.
You lean into it.
You lean into it, and then this becomes part of who you are. Like, I don't know,
well said.
Drunk or whatever.
Yeah, no, super well said. I think something I like to ask individuals, obviously, when we have a lot of rapport and care and whatever, is I go, what purpose is your depression serving you? What need is it fulfilling?
Yeah.
Because sometimes they do think we perpetuate it. That's not to say all depression's like that, and people, absolutely not. We're not talking about a diagnosis here. But there is sometimes a state that we choose to be in because we get something out of it. And we need to figure out, what do we get out of it so that we can get that thing somewhere else. And what a lot of people get out of wanting to be lost is lack of responsibility. It's like, no, I'm not responsible. And that's kind of, you say, like, it's a convenient excuse. And I think loss, if you think about what it means to be the self and responsibility being the pillar of the self, why would you want to be yourself? That is so exhausting. Being lost is kind of like, well, it's not on me. It's the opposite of my title. And I think there's something really comforting about that. And we go, well, if we make a mistake, it's not really our mistake. It really doesn't matter. And we can just kind of float through life without taking any responsibility. And I do think that that's sometimes the reason why people want to remain lost. It's less work.
But also at the same time, I don't know, I'm just, pulling this from top of my head. But also at the same time, I think it's because doing something about it is so difficult, so hard. Especially the deeper you are, the harder it is. And at moments, it's so unfathomable. It's so far away. It's so difficult that it seems like there's a song that I like, Towns Van Zandt, called "Waiting Around to Die."
Beautiful.
Yeah, which would be like the perfect emotion, the atmosphere for this part of the conversation. But
cue music.
Cue this music in, if we want to get demonetized. But the thing is, when you're so far away from it, and you know and you understand, especially if you were at some point in your life that person who had something going, and you understand how difficult it is to keep going day after day after day, and facing the challenges and whatever comes your way, that the only way to be able to do something like that, you need to know why.
You need to know why.
You need to have why.
Yep.
And I think that not having why is one of the biggest things why people stay where they are.
Absolutely. And I think it's kind of the chicken and the egg, because I think the more you become yourself, the more protective of it, and your why becomes stronger.
Yeah.
And so it's expecting to have a fully developed why to motivate you is not realistic. Sometimes we just need to do things and hope that the motivation will come. And I think most humans are like, I want a motivation before I do something. Yeah. And sometimes, in my sessions, I'll be like, you need to do it and watch if motivation finds you. Because you cannot stop living your life because you don't feel motivated. And that's a really difficult position to find ourselves in. And hopefully, I think that most humans, their self-preservation kicks in. And the why is like, I want to live, I deserve to be here, and that keeps us going. If we didn't have that like animalistic evolutionary need to exist, I think a lot of us would have thrown in the towel by now, because living is hard.
Yeah, and this kind of leads us into two different topics, which I think merge into one. The one is going back to the life-altering events, and the way they play their part as a cause of self-loss.
Yep.
And the other one is, let me say, I wrote it down, how does society perpetuate self-loss? Those
fun.
Yeah, those two things kind of merge at a certain point, because
for me, they did.
For you, yes, and for majority people from Western Balkan countries, and especially in Serbia, if we talk about your example.
Yeah.
But also, I'm referring to bombing in 1999, but also before that, the whole Western Balkan countries, the whole former Yugoslavia during the war.
Of course, yeah.
So. So there's this thing, for example, for every individual that found themselves in this situation, this is the life-altering event. that creates, that is a cause for the self-loss. But on the other hand, if we talk about how does society perpetuate the self-loss, is normalizing trauma in a way. But there's also other things that I would like you to
there's so much to say about this. So the interesting and difficult thing about traumatic events is that we can experience the same thing and you can be totally fine, and I might develop PTSD. So it's really hard to say this event was traumatizing for you. I think it's important it's the impact of the event that makes it traumatizing or not. For me, the bombings were traumatizing, and I didn't realize that because it was so normalized by my family. It was like, you know, when kids are like, remember that time we went to the park? Remember that time we got bombed? Like, it was that kind of casualty that we talked about it. So I was like, oh, this is totally normal. And what I didn't do is I didn't think about how something like that during my formative years would have become an obstacle to being myself. And so trauma doesn't necessarily have to lead to self-loss, but it sure as hell doesn't help because it becomes an obstacle or a hindrance, because it becomes unsafe to explore because we have other priorities like self-preservation. So for me, instead of, you know, being, 7, thinking about expressing myself and being curious and aware, all I thought about was preservation.
Yeah.
And I think the Balkans is an interesting example, at least in my personal experience, is like everyone acts like they're in self-preservation and everyone acts like it's normal.
Yeah.
And so we're having a trauma response that's being normalized. And that, I think, gets really, really confusing because as much as we want to be like, screw society, I'm just going to do this on my own, you can't. You, as Heidegger said, you're part of the world is part of you. You need that mirror to reflect back to you. So I needed my therapist to tell me, Sarah, that was traumatic for you. I needed her to say that before I could go, wow, that was traumatic for me, because no one ever had.
Yeah.
And that's interesting of like, we need that mirror to validate our own existence. And it doesn't matter how independent and competent you are, make sure you find people who are willing to see you, willing to see your experiences for what they truly are and reflect them back.
But also...
And not their own experiences, right? Because people are like, I will reflect back to you how I experienced the war. It's like, I don't care. I need you to reflect back how I experience. I need you to validate my experience.
Yeah. Well, hence the therapy.
Hence the therapy. Perfect.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I have a question about it. That concerning Heidegger also at the same time. So, do we have to remove ourselves from that point in order to reveal that previous experience as traumatic? So
environmentally, time.
Could you get to the same point if you stayed here, or you had to be, move away, migrate to Canada, and then with time passing by and with the distance.
Yeah.
And which changed
watching a different culture, watching different kids have completely different childhoods and experiences. That definitely helped me.
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, I remember things.
But is it a necessity?
I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it sure as heck makes it easier. But I don't think it's necessary. I just think it makes it harder because you have to stand up within the culture and go, well, this is not normal. And you hopefully will find a couple people that agree with you.
Yeah, because it becomes extremely difficult to anchor yourself to something we can call a reference point if everything is normalized and there is nothing to be anchored at. So how finding your footing, the starting point from which you can start your journey to better yourself.
And that's kind of leads us back to like my original story of like not knowing there's an alternative. Right? And when there's cultural trauma, so a group of people collectively experiencing the same trauma, it is so hard for anyone to envision a reality that isn't theirs.
Yeah.
And so I do think we lose perspective, and I think trauma becomes almost intensified in contexts like that. So if you stayed here after the war, depending on what your experience is. I know some people are like, that was fun, I got to skip school. And kudos to you. You know, like that's awesome if that was your takeaway. And that's why trauma is an interesting thing. They lived through the same things as me and they don't care. They were like, that was great. Yeah. And I'm like, oh my God, it really, like, yeah. You know, and don't be ashamed of your experience. But I think if you stayed within that culture, you have the task of really going inward and going, what was that like for me? Not what is the narrative of what that was like. How do I feel in my body when I talk about it? Yeah. What emotions come up for me? Because we can all joke about it, but if you're tearing up, if your heart is racing, if you feel like something in the pit of your stomach, then maybe it wasn't so okay for you.
Yeah, but at the same time, whatever it is that you're feeling at this point in time changes over time.
Of course.
So if you reveal something, you should not anchor yourself to this new thing also.
Yeah. You know, it's allow your relationship to the past to evolve.
Yeah.
Right? Like you can't change the past. All you have control over is your narrative and relationship to the past. And sometimes we get so committed to a particular narrative and relationship to it. And I think as we grow and as we change, it's like, revisit that. And I did, you know, when I first realized that I had some trauma, I was 24, my relationship to it was so intense. And, you know, then later on in my late 20s, it was like, okay, I think this is my relationship to it. Now in my 30s, I'm like, okay, I think that. And so I think it's just repositioning and making sure that that relationship remains authentic and it remains part of your narrative, but only in a way that you want it to.
Okay, yeah. And, but this is how society perpetuates. Well, this is not really how society, but it is part of it, how society perpetuates the self-loss. But there's also other ways society perpetuates self-loss.
Is it the appreciation, acknowledgement, and justice? Yeah. I was like, is that what you're alluding to? Yeah. You know, we talk about the prerequisite of self, and this is from existential analysis, and, you know, we kind of believe that you need appreciation, acknowledgement, and justice in order to cultivate the sense of self. And not only do you need it from yourself, you need it from others. Again, it's just that lack of separation from them and us that obviously we strive to create, but also to some extent we can't create in isolation. And so I think, you know, in these, you can speak to Serbian culture more than I can at this point, but it's like, is there appreciation, acknowledgement, and are people being treated justly? That's a huge one globally of like, how much justice? Because when we act inhumanely, you know, are we taking away people's dignity? How are they supposed to feel safe enough or seen enough for their sense of self to be developed? And so I think if you're a partner, a parent, a friend, think to yourself, like, am I acknowledging, appreciating, and treating this person justly? And I think if we collectively did that globally, oh my God, would we have a different society?
Well, yeah.
Lofty goals here.
And another thing that I found very, very fascinating, and it's one that, you know, sets you off. If you have a curious mind, you know, it sets you off on a journey.
You're welcome. I don't even know what it is, but you're welcome.
Well, moral injury.
Oh, I love that topic. Yay.
Well, it's your topic.
Okay, it is my topic. Okay, do you want me to explain what it is?
What is moral injury, right? And how does it reflect on our lives? Well, the way we behave and the consequences of it can be really devastating.
Yeah, of course. So moral injury is a concept and a term coined in 2009, I think by Litz. And it's what happens when we violate or transgress our morals, values, and ethics. What happens when we act out of accordance of who we thought we were? And then, you know, in research, as research developed, it was like, what happens when we witness someone else do that? And so it's more of the moral self, which I love as a topic. I don't think we really discuss each other as moral agents.
Yeah.
When I think about a person, I'm not like, you're a moral being, you know, and that's sad because morality is such a huge component of who we are. So moral injury really focuses on that. And I think the consequences of moral injury are quite dire, suicide being one of them. addiction being a really common one, withdrawal from society and isolation, so much shame. And I think it's because it doesn't target the things that you do, it targets who you are, and it tears you apart. Because if you're not a moral being, that's a really difficult thing to face. And I think individuals who face moral injury, a lot of military studies have been conducted. I studied it in domestic violence and in infidelity. And the hardest part was admitting and seeing themselves as immoral.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really fascinating topic, that in trauma, if we think about the wars that have occurred there, how many people felt like they stayed moral throughout it? That's not even a discussion we're having yet.
Yeah.
And so that's, I don't think we can ignore morality and act immorally and be like, oh, that's okay, I'll make it better later, or I'll pray about it, or I'll confessional or whatever, because that's not what it is. It's about transgressing your own humanity.
Yeah, but how would you define moral injury? Because it's not so easy to define it and make put the brackets, the borders around it.
I mean, the definition is quite literally violation of ethics, values, and morals. Like that is like the most commonly used definition.
But in practice,
you're looking at the consequences of something like that, right? You're looking at the mechanism of cognitive dissonance. So are there actions in tension with their beliefs? And if so, is it resolved? If it's not resolved, that's where moral injury can come in. That's one mechanism, one explanation from Litz as well. It's his model. Now, there are several models out there. This is so new in psychology. So I came up with my own model in my doctoral research. So we're still figuring out, I'm studying the lived experience, the phenomenology of it, because we're trying to understand, what does that feel like? What is living through moral injury like? So it's still quite a new thing.
So can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I'm still having kind of issues to understand it fully.
Yeah.
It kind of, it's like trying to see through the fog.
Yeah.
Because I think it's rooted in the identity, but I'm trying to understand how this identity is created, how much, for example, the circumstances, the environment that you're brought up has to do with it, how much the politics of the environment has to do with it, how much, I don't know, you have fall into the influence of, I don't know, of multi-decade propaganda and the narratives and values imposed to you by family, by society, and by, I don't know, the media. These can fall into, the social media a lot, also because it penetrates the way, so you have a bunch of examples which basically mirrors our everyday life by, telling the story of an ex, you're telling the story of all of us, like opening your eyes, trying to see through the screen, and then within a few seconds picking an icon, and letting the anxiety
wash over you
before you even start the day.
Yeah, exactly.
And so on and so forth, just checking on your Instagram stories while sitting in work every few minutes.
I know, it's like, did I watch my story?
Yeah, did I get some likes, some social capital from it, releasing some endorphins or dopamine, whatever.
Totally.
Yeah, stuff like that. But so talking about the moral injury, of course, it's a big leap from, Instagram likes to moral injuries, but at the same time, not so much because, but I'm trying to understand the principles behind it, how it is rooted and how it develops itself and how we end up breaking the rules that are fundamentally, part of our identity.
Yeah, and so that's interesting one. So I'm going to use infidelity as an example just because I think it's the most tangible. I have found when you look at the experience of moral injury in individuals who have cheated on their partners, they have this time of deconstruction of self, like a really weak sense of self. They feel this sense of death in their relationship. They have this perception of like, this relationship is constraining me so much that I'm dying in it. Okay? So what happens is like a weak, vague sense of identity. And then in order to grasp life, to feel vitality, to feel alive, to feel like themselves, they cheat. And then by cheating, they also transgress themselves and feel less like themselves.
Yeah.
So you have
As
this,
a consequence.
As a consequence.
Yeah.
So what happens is I call it the paradox. In your attempt to grasp, you further lose. And it's like almost like a weird trade, and you're just going back and forth. And you're like, okay, I feel more like myself. At the same time, I've never felt less like myself, because most people don't wake up one day and go, I'm going to cheat on my wife.
Yeah.
And when it happens, they go, wow, I had that moment of embodiment of vitality, and I traded it. And then I also never have felt more alien to myself. I've never felt like a stranger. And I think that that's an interesting dynamic to just understand, like, how the self is implicated in something like that.
Yeah.
And then you have this cognitive dissonance of like, I believe that infidelity is wrong and I'm doing it.
Yeah, and this cognitive dissonance is a thing to, comment on, because it really takes a huge part when we witness somebody else breaking the morals. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And what was interesting to see was the impact that their infidelity or their immorality had. So individuals who believed that the infidelity was wrong because society told them it was wrong, because they grew up Christian, for example, they had an easier time getting over it. They went, you know what? I did what I had to preserve my sense of self. I violated these morals, but they didn't really feel mine. So the consequence was less. And those who really identified with the moral, the consequence was larger. But that just shows you that although you're surrounded by moral norms in your society, it is only to the degree which you really inherently believe them that the impact will matter. So, of course, you might feel shame and guilt, mostly guilt, because you're like, okay, I really effed up, I shouldn't have whatever. But unless that moral is yours, the moral injury doesn't happen when you just violate cultural norms. It happens when you violate your moral norms.
Yeah, and now I would like to go back to actual, now go into existential therapy itself.
Yes.
So the practice that you had, the clients that you had, the experiences that you drew from, and the evolution of the method itself.
Yeah.
Because one thing is, talking about this topic and exploring them through existentialism, existential theory, and philosophy. It's one thing, more or less all of those things can fall into it. But it's a completely different story once there's a human across the table or a room or whatever, and then you're talking to them, and now they having some sort of existential crisis. We've been through a bunch of those in this conversation, whatever those are. But how the methods, what are the methods of existential therapy, how the practice looks like, how they are developed, like the history of it. So we know that Viktor Frankl was the one who coined it, I think, right?
Logotherapy.
Logotherapy, yeah. So just give me the brief history of it and how it looks in the practice and the methodology of it.
So the way it looks in practice is how it's kind of reflected in our conversation, by the way, because you would ask me a really philosophical question and I almost always exclusively answer them psychologically.
Yeah.
And that was on purpose, because I think the psychology of it is the point of this conversation. And so it really shapes the way that the therapist thinks, conceptualizes change and suffering, right?
Repeat that, sorry.
It's important. It's how the therapist conceptualizes pain and suffering and change.
Okay, pain, suffering, and change. Okay.
What happens is we have this thing called case conceptualization. So you have someone come in, present their problems, and you have to understand what is happening. And each therapist would choose a theory that helps them understand what is happening. So if you're practice attachment theory, you're going to look at it through the lens of attachment. You're going to be like, which attachment is flaring up? If you're a CBT therapist, you're going to look for
cognitive behavioral, right? Okay.
And so as an existentialist, what you're looking for is themes that we've discussed: responsibility, freedom, death, anxiety, isolation, all of these things, to try to understand where the pain is. And the 4 questions that I offered from Längle are really helpful for me. I go, which of the 4 fundamental motivations are they struggling with? Which of the pillars feels weak? Okay, they don't feel like they like it here. that's where we begin. Existential therapy is known to be anti-technique. A lot of therapy, therapists will come in being like, today we're going to work on this. And they have worksheets and they're like ready. They're like, we're going to do this technique, this breathing, this, that. And I think most existentialists, and I can't speak for all, you don't do that. It's scary, actually. I find it sometimes really nice when I use, because I use other techniques, of course. But when I'm like, oh, today we're going to just, going into the room and being like, very phenomenological, because actually the method is phenomenology. It's going to the things themselves. What are they presenting? How do they appear to me? What is being evoked? And having the most intimate of encounters. That is existential therapy. And, we have Yalom, we have Rollo May, who are existential therapy, and then we have kind of this other branch, more specifically, Viktor Frankl started logotherapy. And then from logotherapy, now we have existential analysis. So we kind of have this little niche that I belong to. And of course we have, but I find that a lot of our trainings, a lot of the time you spent, it's more like how to show up in the space, how to conceptualize things, how to guide them. But it's not about fixing, doing very specific techniques. It's like teaching someone how to exist.
Okay.
That's very different type of work than like, I'm just going to help you alleviate a symptom, which by the way, we will do as well. But the focus is not the problem. The focus is the person. And that's not always, that's why it's considered also a person-centered therapy.
Okay.
Because we're really focused on that relationship between the therapist and the client.
I would dare to try to define it the way, like, it seems to me that it's like introducing humanity to the practice. Like,
Isn't it sad that we have to do that in psychology?
Well, I haven't really thought of those topics before. For example, I don't know, the reading the trauma of the gifted child and drama of the gifted child and reading some Gabor Mate, and that's when I'm listening to him speak. It was like, how many doctors have asked you about, I don't know, your colon or your blood work or whatever? How many of those doctors ask you, how are you?
Yeah.
Just a simple, basic question that nobody asks it. It seems,
or no one wants an answer to. They're like, okay, cool.
Yeah, yeah, because answering that question and entering that conversation, it's
my job, apparently,
Well, it is.
It is. It absolutely is. And I like that you're saying that. I think my passion and movement for existential therapy is because I think what has happened lately is we have dehumanized the science of psychology. But that's the soul of the work and the art of it. I think it's as much art as it is science. And I think I'm trying to hold on to something that's very human and very essential in this practice.
Yeah, but the other thing is, I think that it's kind of just my thought, my 2 cents on it. But you have to deal with the obstacles of, you have to relearn the commonplaces in things. You have to, like, the point of everything is something that we would call, I don't know, cliche, but those are actually true facts, and you have to somehow circle back to them via this very complicated and
very complicated theory
and hard process.
It is hard, but it's cliche because of how we've reduced it to something meaningless. So a lot of my stuff is psychoeducation. It's like, let me teach you what authenticity really means. Let me teach you what choices and freedom and responsibility, what do those terms actually mean, rather than, everything they're saying is probably how the cliches started. It's like we have all these concepts that are so true to the human condition. And I think existentialism is also just common sense sometimes. Because you study the human condition. So nothing I tell you is going to be groundbreaking. And it shouldn't be, to an extent, because it should resonate with your own humanity. So if it resonates, that means I've done my job, because what I'm doing is just explaining the human experience. Yeah,
but also another thing that I found really interesting is how does existential therapy deals with the final consequences. And in terms of like when we talk about, for example, going back to Heidegger, I mean, in between authenticity and unauthenticity, and once you start the journey of authenticity, the ultimate confrontation is, of course, death. You know, confronting death, because at the end of the day, doesn't matter how tough the conversation is. It doesn't matter how far we're running away from it.
Yeah.
The fact of things is this: you are going to die. I'm going to die. Marco is going to die, and everybody who listening is going to die.
Beautiful. I love this. But I think the fact that we're going to die is what gives life meaning.
Yeah. But you have to reach that.
You have to reach that. But it's, if you think about this, I've done long distance relationships. I'm not sure if anyone has. I write about this in my book. It's like you're together for a month and sometimes you're like, oh my God, I don't even want to talk to you. Like, I'm going to go to the other room, and you're not really that
don't worry.
really not that connected or whatever. And then 3 days before they leave, you're like, oh my God, I really can't, you know? And that's because you know your time is finite. You know the time is coming to an end, and everything becomes sweeter and more precious. And I think instead of being so anxious about death, which I mean is very normal, I think we can also see it as that which gives us a border that actually makes our life meaningful.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really pleasant reframe. If you were going to live forever, would life have any meaning?
Yeah, this is a very interesting philosophical question, because if life lasted forever, everybody would cheat on everyone at certain point.
I mean, they already do. If you look at stats on infidelity, oh my God. Like,
what are the stats?
Oh, they're so high. It depends on the country. But I think, you know, I think it was something like if you ask someone if they've cheated ever on any partner within their lifetime, it's like 75 to 86% or something like that. And if you add emotional infidelity, I think we're like in the 90th percentile.
Yeah.
Which is a whole discussion of like, are humans monogamous?
Yeah.
What is modern monogamy? Does that make more sense? That's a completely different
but there's
discussion.
also another. I stumbled upon a very interesting conversation about, you know, if we somehow medically, you know, via technology, prolonged human life up to 200 years, 300 years, 400 years, 500 years. It doesn't matter. But, you know,
I'm tapping out at 100. I'm like, that's good.
Yeah.
I'm good.
There's a new question emerging on the surface: the motivation for living.
Yeah.
Because, you know, and this, you know, leads you on a completely different path of understanding what human beings are. And
I love that.
Yeah, and I really like that. But also the confrontation of death is something that there's, well, two things that I'm just having, they're just association that I'm having now. First of all is how difficult it is through therapy. You know, you probably have seen the process, you know, from the start to the end. How does it look like? And what is the response of people who have finally confronted that ultimate question? That's one thing. And the other one that just came to my mind is, this seems like something that would be really useful in palliative care.
It is very useful in palliative care.
Yeah.
That's a really great observation. Okay, first question. What does the process look like? It's messy and long. No. That's what it looks like, right? And it's meant to be. I think you start from basics of observing the truth, and then facing the truth, and then accepting the truth. And I think it's that constant becoming. And depending on what the presenting issue is, obviously, you know, that process looks different. You're usually working through the 4 fundamental motivations. And what I find that happens is when people finally grasp their sense of self, and this is something that surprised me maybe even, is, well, 2 things happen. One, they get ecstatic, and they can't imagine a life without their self, which is beautiful, and it motivates them to keep living that way. Because I think once you have, it's almost like when you get your first paycheck, then you're more motivated to work because you know what it feels like to hold $100. And so that's kind of the feeling of like, I'm going to keep working on myself because this feels so good. And I know the work is hard, but it feels so good. I don't think there's any sense of fulfillment. I mean, for me personally, becoming my own is like the thing that brings me most joy and fulfillment in my life. And it makes life a lot easier to an extent as well. And there's so much liberation and empowerment. And so seeing clients grasp that and their eyes light up with joy is beautiful. And then what happens is they become so scared to lose it that they get paralyzed. This is something I'm noticing a lot in my work, where they go, I don't want to date anyone because what if I lose myself in the relationship again? I don't want to do this transition because maybe I won't be able to be myself in that context. And they are so scared to lose it, but then what they're doing without realizing is they're losing themselves by inaction.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like the cyclical work that you win if you, like, it's a lose-lose. That's what it feels like for them a little bit. And so I don't think anyone's had to face the fact that, like, okay, ultimately, I guess some clients will be like, what's the freaking point? I'm just going to die. Yeah. And I go, you're not working towards a goal. You're working towards having an enjoyable existence. I'm not saying so that when you're 100, you're self-actualized. Fuck, who cares? Like, it doesn't matter. What matters, though, is that you lived an existence you wanted to live up to 100. So those are my answers.
Yeah. Well, this circles back to, oh God, man, is it Kierkegor or who said it? Or Sartre, I can't remember who some of those guys. Yeah, he's attributed to
some philosopher.
One of those three.
Yeah,
one of those three main guys. Maybe Camus, but not really. Saying the leap of faith.
Oh, we talked.
The leap of faith. Like not taking the leap. Taking the leap of faith means losing yourself momentarily.
Oh, Kierkegaard. Oh, I start my book with that quote.
Yeah, making the leap of faith is losing yourself completely.
Yeah, exactly.
Forever or whatever.
That's literally one of the first quotes. It's attributed to Kierkegaard. Yeah. We can't confirm it is, but apparently it sounds like him. And yeah, to not dare is to lose. Oh, to dare is to lose yourself momentarily. To dare or to not dare is to lose yourself forever. Yeah, okay. To dare, you lose yourself momentarily or something like that. And then,
So, and this is a very interesting one.
I butchered that. I'm sorry.
Don't worry. People can Google it.
You can Google it. It's in the book. Yeah.
So, but the thing is, buy the book.
Yeah, buy the book. Thank you.
This is the book.
It's also in English and going to be in German and 15 other languages. So
it's translated already on how many languages?
I think currently translations are up to 16. They're not all out, but right now it's mostly just English, and Serbian's one of the first international.
Awesome. So I will put the link in the description so you can buy the book. And this is a very interesting one, because this leap of faith, or to dare, it's not something you do once.
Yeah, such a good point. No, it's life is constantly asking you to dare and to be audacious. And I think you're like, oh, I took the leap. Whew, I survived. And then in therapy, I go, take another. Yeah. And they're like, but I thought I was done. And I'm like,
oh, no.
I'm so sorry. And sometimes, I love this. Like, Viktor Frankl has this client who comes to him, and this is in Men's Search for Meaning. He goes, can you explain to me what the difference between psychoanalysis and logotherapy is? The client is asking. And so Viktor is like, can you tell me what you think psychoanalysis is first before I tell you a contradiction? He goes, or the difference? And he goes, well, in psychoanalysis, you lie down and you say things that make you uncomfortable. I'm paraphrasing. So Viktor Frankl's thinking there. He goes, okay, well, in existentialism, you can keep sitting, but you're going to hear things you don't want to hear. So it's not about just the confessional aspect. It's part of existentialism is showing you those really hard truths. And that is my job, which is a weird job, to be their mirror, and that will automatically sometimes mean that I mirror back to them how hard life is. Yeah,
and it goes back to this point of most of the time the therapist is the one who listens, and your friends are the one giving you advice, and you want it to be other way around. You want your friends to listen and your therapist to give you advice.
But therapists are, from the way I don't give advice.
Yeah, I'm not talking
about
advice,
I love it, but I think that's really an important thing for people to understand. It's advice is a serious thing, and I wrote about this recently. It's people ask for advice, and then they're not brave enough to hear it. You know, they'll be like, what should I do? And then you'll tell them and be like, no, because they just can't hear the reality of it. And so if you're asking someone for advice, be brave enough to actually listen to what they have to say. You don't have to obey what they have to say, but be brave enough to listen to what they have to say.
And I'm going to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, who said, the only thing you can do with good advice is to pass it on.
To pass it
Because you're not going to act on it.
Oh, of course not. Imagine. Life would be too easy.
Yes. And so this part of daring, and this is something that also, something that I realized only once I found myself in this situation. It's like, okay, I dared once, and then life asked me to do it again, and then to do it again. And then you have to meet the terms of, you have to be comfortable with, having a constant state of daring to do stuff. And therefore, you really need the good why in order to keep daring, if that's a correct use of the word. Yeah, so, and this is an interesting one, but also another one that I have a comment on that you said, I think that this analogy maybe wasn't really the good one, because you said the feeling you get, I don't know, $100 or something, you said it motivates you to do the job. I would, debate that maybe it's going to motivate you once, or maybe it's going to motivate you every time you get a raise or more money, but it's going to motivate you in short bursts. It's not going to be a motivation that's going to stick.
For sure. And if you're talking about normal things like getting $100 bill, yes. But if you're talking about being authentic, I think the act of being authentic itself, you get a burst of it from moment to moment. Because as we know, authenticity is the ownership of every single moment. So I think the fact that it's so correlated and it's ongoing, I think the ownership part of it does... Because it happens from moment to moment, it feels like an ongoing motivation. Rather than a one-time thing. But you're right, with most things, it's like interval, like reinforcement, It's like once in a while, you get it, that's great. But I think when you're like, wow, I set that boundary, you get that like rush, and then you go, wow, I was tired and I went to bed because I listened to my body. Like every single moment, you can get that understanding. And I think... it's like when you date someone and the first time you kiss them and you have that closeness and you love that closeness and you intimacy and you're like, I want to have that again. And I think that's kind of falling in love with yourself, and not in like I love myself, but like it's building that closeness with yourself, that when you feel that person within you, it is so motivational to preserve that connection, because you don't want to be far away from the person that you care about and the person you're invested in, kind of like you wouldn't want to be far away from the person you just started dating that you really care about. So I do think that there is something about that closeness that makes you yearn for more.
Okay. And another thing, once you find that person within you and you fall in love with that person, you should also let them go and let that person, evolve. Evolve and eventually die. We're all gonna die.
No, that's promo for this podcast. We're all gonna die.
It's a tagline.
Yeah, perfect.
Soundbite.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I think that's the thing where you're like, oh my God, this feels so good. And then you have to not over-identify with it, not become constrained by it. And you have to go, the person I'm going to meet tomorrow, let me fall in love with them again. And again, love might not be the right, let me get to know them again. Let me experience closeness with them. I think a lot of people talk about self-love, which is exhausting in terms of, you're like, love yourself. And for me, it's like, know who you are, accept who you are, respect yourself, like yourself, and then maybe one day ultimately you will love that person. But assuming someone to go from nothing to love, it's an impossible
It's going to
task.
take a lot of effort to reach the point, but once you reach that point, it's not going to take any effort to love yourself.
Exactly. And that's going to be so motivational, because think about, I don't know, the person you love. It's not very hard to know how you want to protect them, what decisions you want to make for them. Like it's kind of like that, and you're motivated by your love. And I think love can be a motivation for self as well.
Hey, Sarah, I just checked my watch.
Yes, subtly.
We have reached the deadline. Yeah,
We did it.
We did it. We did it. We did it. We cramped everything. Not really everything, but most
things.
Most things. Yes. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. That was really fun.
Thank you. And your book, Na meni je, you can order it, buy it online. I'll put the link in the description. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. I wish you awesome book tour.
Thank you very much.
Go home back to yourself.
Oh, I will. You too.
Thank you. That's it. Ciao.